Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters, welcome to a new episode from the second series of Know Your Prophet. We continue to talk about the chapter of the worship of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's one of the longer chapters in the book, and it contains a great deal of benefit for us in terms of how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to be and how he used to worship. And so I think it's beneficial for us to continue with the ahadith in this chapter. وعن عائشة رضي الله عنها أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يصلي من الليل 11 ركعة يوتر منها بواحدة فإذا فرغ منها اضطجع على شقه الأيمن. It's mentioned from Aisha radiallahu anha that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to pray 11 raka'at at night. One of them he would pray as witr on its own. So when he finished from them, he would lie down on his right hand side. We've mentioned a lot about the different numbers, and indeed we can mention the next hadith. وَعَنْهَا أَنَّهَا قَالَتْ كَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ يُصَلِّي مِنَ اللَّيْلِ 9 رَكَعَاتٍ. The Prophet ﷺ used to pray 9 raka'ah at night. So we've seen lots of different numbers. We said that if we join between all of them, then how we can join between the hadith of Ibn Abbas and the hadith of Aisha and the other narrations of Aisha is to say that the Prophet ﷺ prayed 8 raka'at of tahajjud, of the night prayer, and he would either pray 2 raka'at of Isha before, or 2 raka'at of ash-shaf' before the witr prayer, and then he would finish with 1, or he would pray the witr as 1 on its own. وعن حذيفة بن اليمان رضي الله عنه أنه صلى مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من الليل. Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman رضي الله عنه reported that he prayed the night prayer with the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. قال فلما دخل في الصلاة قال. He said when he began his prayer, he had entered into the prayer, he had done his takbir, he said, Allahu Akbar, Lord of the dominion and Lord of power and majesty and magnificence. He made this dua that he began his prayer with. قال ثم قرأ البقرة. He said then he read Surah Al-Baqarah. After Surah Al-Fatiha, he read Al-Baqarah. ثم ركع. Then he made ruku'. فكان ركوعه نحوا من قيامه. His ruku' was of a very similar length to his standing. And this is an important point in the etiquettes and the manners, the characteristics of the prayer of the Prophet ﷺ that I see many of us falling short in today. And that is that what we do with regard to our prayer is we tend to lengthen the qiyam and we tend to make the ruku' and the sujood very, very short. As opposed to the prayer of the Prophet ﷺ, that he read Al-Baqarah, and then he made his ruku' something similar to the length of his qiyam. Now a person might say, how do you lengthen your ruku' such a length? And some of the scholars said, in describing the prayer of the Prophet ﷺ, we could not extend the length to that degree if it were not for the extra sunnah du'as and adhkar that you can say in ruku'. For example, Allahumma laka raka'tu wa bika amantu wa laka aslamt. And the different du'as you can say. From this is also saying Subhana Rabbi al-Azim more than 3 times. But to lengthen this to this degree, you would imagine the Prophet ﷺ would mention many of the optional adhkar with regard to the ruku' and the sujood. And so we should take it to at least practice lengthening our ruku' in our prayer a little bit and trying to make the parts of our prayer relatively even instead of making our qiyam very long and our ruku' barely enough to say Subhana Rabbi al-Azim before rising from ruku'. وَكَانَ يَقُولُ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْعَظِيمِ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْعَظِيمِ ثُمَّ رَفَعَ رَأْسَهُ. And he used to say Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, Subhana Rabbi al-Azim. Then he raised up his head. فَكَانَ قِيَامُهُ نَحْوًا مِنْ رُكُوعِهِ. And his second standing was of a similar length to that of his ruku'. So again, when he would stand up, the only way you can imagine this is if he were to mention many of the optional adhkar and the optional du'as at this point, such as saying رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدِ حَمْدًا كَثِيرًا طَيِّبًا مُبَارَكًا فِيهِ, or something similar to this. وَكَانَ يَقُولُ لِرَبِّيَ الْحَمْدِ لِرَبِّيَ الْحَمْدِ, and he would say, to my Lord belongs all praise, to my Lord belongs all praise. ثُمَّ سَجَدَ فَكَانَ سُجُودُهُ نَحْوًا مِنْ قِيَامِهِ, and then he made sujood, and his sujood was of a similar length to his qiyam. It was of a similar length to the time that he stood, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَكَانَ يَقُولُ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْأَعْلَى سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْأَعْلَى ثُمَّ رَفَعَ رَأْسَهُ. He would say سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْأَعْلَى سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْأَعْلَى, then he raised up his head. فَكَانَ بَيْنَ السَّجْدَتَيْنِ نَحْوًا مِنَ السُّجُودِ. So the time he spent sitting between the two prostrations was similar to the time that he spent in sujood. وَكَانَ يَقُولُ رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي, and he would say, my Lord forgive me, my Lord forgive me, and he would repeat this. And then the narrator says, Hudayfa radiallahu anhu says, حَتَّى إِذَا قَرَأَ الْبَقَرَةِ وَآلِ عِمْرَانِ وَالنِّسَاءِ وَالْمَائِدَةِ وَالْأَنْعَامِ, until he had read Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran and Surah Al-Nisa and Al-Ma'idah and Surah Al-An'am. And you know how long that length is. To read Al-Baqarah, Ali Imran, Al-Nisa, Al-Ma'idah and Surah Al-An'am, and Shu'bah الذي شك في المائدة والأنعام. However, there was a narrator who doubted, did he say Al-Ma'idah or Al-An'am, or he finished at Surah Al-Nisa. One of the narrators had some doubt, but some of the other narrations authentically mention that he finished with Surah Al-An'am. So this gives you an idea of the length of the night prayer of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course the sunnah with regard to the length of the prayers, and from the shama'il of the Prophet ﷺ with regard to the length of the prayers, is that the Prophet ﷺ would keep his prayers relatively short when he was with his companions in most instances. I.e., when he was leading the obligatory prayers, he would keep his prayer short in most instances. And he would leave the length of his prayer to be for the night prayer. The long prayers, he would leave that to be for the night prayer, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And of course, this is part, first of all, of making it easy for people. It helps to make it easy for those people praying, the elderly, the infirm, ladies are praying behind. So the Prophet ﷺ would shorten his obligatory prayer, and it also makes it more sincere, because when you are praying for Allah Azza wa Jal on your own and there is nobody there, so you lengthen your prayer, and there is no fear of lengthening the prayer for the sake of showing off, since there is nobody there. Or the Prophet ﷺ's instance, there were people with him, but the majority, when people pray on your own in the night prayer, then there's nobody there. And Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. We'll talk more after the break, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Our next hadith, عن عائشة رضي الله عنها أنها قالت قام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بآية من القرآن ليلة. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم stood for one whole night reciting a single ayah of the Quran. And this shows us that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would be varied in his recitation. Sometimes he would repeat an ayah, sometimes he would read a great deal of the Quran, a great large point of the Quran. Sometimes he would repeat certain parts. It's mentioned that in some instances he would read the ayat that relate to paradise and the ayat that relate to hellfire. So there was a variation in the way the Prophet ﷺ would read his night prayer. And at times he would simply repeat one ayah of the Quran in order to take lesson from it and to reflect upon it deeply. And this is narrated from some of the companions of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ as well. عن عبد الله رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه قال صليت ليلة مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فلم يزل قائما حتى هممت بأمر سوء قيل له ما هممت به قال هممت أن أقعد وأدع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh said, I prayed a night with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he stood for so long that I had in my mind to do an evil deed or to do something wrong. They said, what wrong thing did you intend to do? He said, I intended to sit down and leave the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I.e., his prayer was so long that the Sahaba who were accustomed to a long prayer, who were completely accustomed to the length of the prayer, the Sahaba struggled to match the length of the prayer of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is from the one whose sins were forgiven, the previous sins and the latter sins. And he said, أَفَلَا أَكُونُ عَبْدًا شَكُورًا, should I not be a grateful slave? عن عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يصلي جالسا فقرأ وهو جالس فإذا بقي من قراءته ما يكون 30 أو 40 آية قام فقرأ وهو قائم ثم ركع وسجد ثم صنع في الركعة الثانية مثل ذلك. Aisha radiallahu anha narrated that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would sometimes pray sitting down, i.e. the night prayer. The voluntary prayers, he would sometimes pray sitting down. And he would read while he was sitting down. Then, if he had around 30 or 40 ayat left, he would stand up and he would read those 30 or 40 ayat standing. Then he would make ruku' and sujood. Then in the second raka'ah, he would do the same. It's mentioned that the one who prays sitting gains half the reward of the one who prays standing. And the Prophet ﷺ occasionally prayed sitting. And this is again a way to get you into praying more voluntary prayers. Sometimes you feel like you might struggle to stand, but you can pray sitting, inshaAllah. And the Prophet ﷺ, if there was a portion of the Quran left, he'd stand, finish that little portion standing, and then make his rak'ah as normal, and make his sujood as normal, and so on and so forth. وعن عبد الله بن شقيق قال سألت عائشة رضي الله عنها عن صلاة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن تطوعه. He said, Abdullah ibn Shaqiq said, I asked Aisha radiallahu anha about the prayer of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, about his voluntary prayer. So he's very clear here. I didn't ask about his fard prayer. فقالت, she said, radiallahu anha, كان يصلي ليلا طويلا قائما وليلا طويلا قاعدا. He prayed a long night standing, and he would sometimes pray a long night sitting. فإذا قرأ وهو قائم ركع وسجد وهو قائم وإذا قرأ وهو جالس ركع وسجد وهو جالس. If the Prophet ﷺ was standing, then he would make ruku' and he would make sujood while he was standing. And if he was sitting, then he would make ruku' and he would make sujood while he was sitting. So this is different to the previous example when the Prophet ﷺ would stand up and then make the rak'ah standing. In this example, the Prophet ﷺ made the ruku' sitting and made the sujood sitting and continued sitting. And he prayed a long time, sometimes standing, and sometimes he prayed a long time sitting, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يمت حتى كان أكثر صلاته وهو جالس. Aisha radiallahu anha narrated, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam did not die before most of his prayer was made sitting. And this is from the mercy of Allah Azza wa Jal towards this ummah, that He has given options for those people who become older, who struggle to stand, that their prayer doesn't have to cease. Just because you have some pains in your legs and you're struggling to stand a little bit, doesn't mean your prayer has to stop. Your prayer can continue as it was before. All you have to do is simply to pray sitting as the Prophet ﷺ did. However, we should also mention in this, brothers and sisters, that when it comes to the fard prayer, you must not sit unless you have a serious, genuine medical need for doing so. And that is because standing in the fard prayer is a pillar and a condition of the prayer. Unless the person is unable, So if a person has very bad legs, they can't stand, they suffer pain, they can sit. If a person is having an injury and they can't pray standing, they can sit. As for the voluntary prayers, then you can sit as much as you want, whether you are completely healthy or completely sick. وعن ابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما أنه قال صليت مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ركعتين قبل الظهر وركعتين بعدها وركعتين بعد المغرب في بيته وركعتين بعد العشاء في بيته. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma said, I prayed with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam before Dhuhr 2 rak'ah, and 2 rak'ah after it, and 2 rak'ah after Maghrib in his home, and 2 rak'ah after Isha in his home. We should be aware that the voluntary prayers, brothers and sisters, are of different types. The most important of all of the voluntary prayers is the witr, followed by the 2 rak'ah before Fajr. And then you have the rawatib prayers, the regular ratiba, regular sort of prayers, 12 rak'ah during the day, 2 rak'ah before Fajr, 2 plus 2 before Dhuhr, 2 after Dhuhr, 2 after Maghrib, and 2 after Isha. And Ibn Umar prayed these along with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And it is mentioned that the 2 rak'ah after Maghrib and after Isha were prayed at home. In general, we know the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to pray almost all of his voluntary prayers at home, and that this is the greater reward and it's nearer to Allah Azza wa Jal. However, if a person struggles to pray them at home, you should be aware of how the shaitan influences you, and you should realize that this happens. The shaitan says to you, go and pray it at home, there is more reward. And when you go home to pray, your children make you busy, your family make you busy, and then you don't pray it. Rather, it is better for you in that case to pray it in the masjid until you become consistent in praying it at home. وعنه أيضا رضي الله عنهما قال حفظت من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 8 ركعات. I learned from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, or I memorized from him 8 voluntary raka'at. قبل الظهر 4 وركعتين بعدها. Before Dhuhr, 4 raka'ah, i.e. 2 plus 2, and 2 after it. We say 2 plus 2 because the Prophet ﷺ prayed all of his voluntary prayers, mathna, mathna, 2 by 2. وَرَكْعَتَيْنِ بَعْدَ الْمَغْرِبِ, and 2 raka'ah after Maghrib, وَرَكْعَتَيْنِ بَعْدَ الْعِشَاءِ, and 2 raka'ah after Isha. And Ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma said, حَدَّثَتْنِ حَفْصَةٌ بِرَكْعَتَيْ الْغَدَاءِ لَمْ أَكُنْ أَرَاهَا مِنَ النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Hafsa told me about the 2 raka'ah before Fajr. I didn't see them from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because his 2 raka'ah, as we know, used to be done when he would wake up immediately, and he would pray always in his house, these 2 raka'ah. Never ever he would pray them in the masjid, always in his house. And in general, you'll find it's easier to pray the prayers that are before the salah in home than it is to pray the ones after the salah. And Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. So he didn't see it from the Prophet ﷺ, but his sister Hafsa radiallahu anha, she told him that he used to, in addition to 2 plus 2 before Dhuhr, 2 after Dhuhr, 2 after Maghrib, and 2 after Isha, in addition to this, he used to also pray 2 before Fajr, and those we also know about from the worship of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the final hadith that we have for this episode to conclude the chapter, from Asim ibn Damrah أنه قال سألنا عليا رضي الله عنه عن صلاة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من النهار. Asim, he said, we asked Ali رضي الله عنه regarding the prayer of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم in the day. فقال إنكم لا تطيقون ذلك. He said, you will not be able to pray as he prayed during the day. قال فقلنا. He said, we said back to Ali, من أطاق ذلك منا صلى. Tell us so that whoever of us does find the ability to do it, he can pray like this. فقال كان إذا كانت الشمس من هنا كهيئتها من هنا عند العصر. He said, if the sun rose in the morning to a similar height as it would be at the time of Asr, i.e. the opposite side, where the sun rises and sets, so at the same kind of height that the sun would be at Asr, but in the morning, when this time came, صلى ركعتين. The Prophet ﷺ would pray 2 raka'at. وإذا كانت الشمس من هنا كهيئتها من هنا عند الظهر. And when the sun reached to this around the time that it would be at Dhuhr, صلى أربعا ويصلي قبل الظهر أربعا. So just before the Zawal, he would pray 4 raka'ah, I mean from Duha. Then after the Zawal, he would pray 4 raka'ah, i.e. the Ratib before Dhuhr. وذكر أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يصليها عند الزوال ويمد فيها. And he mentioned the Prophet ﷺ prayed this Duha prayer before the Zawal, and he would make it very long. وبعدها ركعتين. And after Dhuhr, he would pray 2 raka'at. وقبل العصر أربعة. And before Asr, he would pray 4 raka'at. ويفصل بين كل ركعتين بالتسليم على الملائكة المقربين والنبيين ومن تبعهم من المؤمنين أو المسلمين. So he said that before Asr he would pray 4, and then between each 2 raka'at he would break it with a taslim upon the noble angels and the prophets and those who followed them from the believers and the Muslims. This 4 before Asr, and indeed these other raka'at that are outside of the Ratibah, the regular 12 that you pray, these are things the Prophet ﷺ would pray from time to time. He would pray when he was in Medina and when he had the strength to do so and when he was well. Otherwise, he would vary the length of his prayers according to the situation and according to the circumstances. And these are some of the other voluntary prayers, including the Duha prayer. And that's all we have time for in this episode. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.